Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran, and I hope you guys are enjoying your international breaks. Obviously, a nice little time to sort of relax from Premier League football, maybe reassess as well, and actually look ahead towards Game Week 9, which is obviously the impending game week. So far, we actually haven't had many injuries. One injury I'll talk about that actually has a little bit of relevance to the defender position, but I don't think beyond that there's actually been major consequences in FPL. So obviously, we have to sort of stay tuned to the second week of fixtures and see what happens there. But so far, so good. As far as transfers, we're obviously going to be prioritizing on all positions with exception to the goalkeepers. I don't think much has really changed there in terms of my sort of estimation of them, and I don't think there are any pressing transfers at the same time. We'll also be talking about captaincy at the end of the video. But let's actually get started with the midfielders. Obviously, the midfield position is an interesting one because I think a lot of people are now looking ahead towards the West Ham players and the Brighton players, specifically Matoma when we talk about the midfield picks. But one thing I would like to say, of course, is that it is very reminiscent of, for example, Watkins, right? Where before he started his good run of fixtures, he had that Brighton game and he did go off. But I think that is such a rare, once in a lifetime type of event. We don't need to sort of overreact into just jumping onto players who we know are very, very good, like a Bowen, like a Matoma. In my opinion, it's still a good opportunity here to actually, for example, reserve a bit of judgment. Ultimately, City are one of the top teams defensively. And when you look at, let's say, a team like West Ham, they still have an Aston Villa fixture that is relatively tough. So no reason, in my opinion, to actually exercise the transfer unless you're really forced to. And unless you're wildcarding, I don't think there's a need to, for example, jump onto the Brighton fixture swing or the West Ham fixture swing. This is a week where actually you should be rolling. A lot of teams, even, for example, bad teams that we think have gotten so much worse in estimation compared to what we thought in Game Week 1, like in Manchester United, still it's worth seeing that fixture out because Sheffield United really is just that bad of a team. And when you look at, let's say, another maybe target for transfers, Spurs, of course, they still have a great fixture, Newcastle as well. And it's still the time to actually reassess, in my opinion, Game Week 10, which is why a lot of people were either going to wildcard in Game Week 8 or Game Week 10. And it seems like obviously the big difference between Game Week 8 and 10 wildcards, in my opinion, is actually how many Spurs players you're going to carry onto that wildcard draft. Because I myself, as a Game Week 8 wildcarder, I'm looking towards probably only keeping 2 of my Spurs assets in Game Week 10, maybe only one of them at the end of it. So that's the sort of landscape, in my opinion. I don't think much has changed. It's more of a question of how much Spurs do you own versus how much Arsenal do you own. And because obviously Saka and let's say his injury, we don't really have many updates on that. I don't think there's really anything to exercise in terms of the midfield position. So what I would say is it's the time to really look at the budget position. This is the time now where finally Salah is one of those picks where a lot of people, even if they're wildcarding or not, are jumping onto Salah with 2 free transfers or taking a hit towards Salah because this is a great week once again to reconsider a Salah captaincy. Now, I personally am of the mind that I think a Salah Haaland draft is probably the best, but you can definitely go Haaland less, and that way it's quite simple. You can just go, let's say, Haaland to Watkins and Salah to obviously a premium midfielder of your choice. But if you're trying to retain the Salah Haaland structure, you do need to look for a budget midfielder, and I do think the discussion is between 3 picks primarily. It's, in my opinion, Neto, Gordon, and Gibbs White. I actually would rate them in that order, 1, 2, 3. I actually own Anthony Gordon, full disclosure, because I sort of rate Newcastle's team strength extremely highly. I'm not super confident in terms of Anthony Gordon's minutes. I don't think, for example, he has minutes that are comparable to, let's say, Gibbs White or Pedro Neto, but I do think the upside is there with Anthony Gordon. And the big difference, of course, when you compare to, let's say, Gibbs White, he might be on penalties, but keep in mind, of course, with Awani out, Chris Wood could be taking penalties, which is why I think Gibbs White has actually dropped in terms of my estimation. He does have the best fixture when it comes to Game Week 9. So when you're jumping onto, let's say, a draft this time round and you're, let's say, inserting Gibbs White, obviously, look, you're front loading the best fixture possible. It's Luton Town at home. It doesn't get any better than that, other than maybe Sheffield United at home, if we're being honest. So I do like Gibbs White, but I do think you're also investing into probably the weakest attacking team out of the 3. I think Wolves have actually stepped up in our estimation. We saw that in Game Week 5. And in my next video, which is going to be the What We've Learned series for Game Week 9, once again, you'll see that Wolves have actually improved once again. So I would say I like Neto the most just because he actually has a lot of guarantees, right? You've got guarantees in minutes. He plays effectively 90 plus minutes per game. He is someone who is the key creative outlet of the team. And, irrespective of whether Hwang actually gets consistent minutes going forwards, he still actually has relatively good goal threat. Whereas Anthony Gordon, I think, has better underlying stats. But keep in mind, of course, because his peers are so strong as well, that, for example, reduces Anthony Gordon's avenue to, let's say, getting bonus points and things like that as well. Unless he himself has a brilliant game. So you're sort of reliant upon direct returns. Whereas someone like Neto, that, for example, if Wolves were actually to win, let's say, game 1-0, and he's the one sort of unique return in that situation, then of course you're going to get more access to bonus points as well. So I think those two picks are very, very close. And Gibbs White, unfortunately, because I no longer have the full confidence that he's on penalties now that Wood is probably going to play at least 60 minutes per game. I think that just makes it a little bit tougher to back Gibbs White for the time being. So those are those three picks. And as I said, I'd rate them in terms of Neto Gordon. I don't think you can really go wrong between Neto and Gordon. And I think Hwang is too much of a differential. Now, people have also been talking about Cole Palmer, but I've actually suggested Cole Palmer within my Game Week 9 wildcard draft. And the whole idea is that, in my opinion, Palmer is just an 8th attacker. I see him exactly the same as Archer. I just see him as basically a steroided version of Archer, someone who actually is a lot better, because by actually spending that 0.4 million, you're getting a player who's actually going to be hopefully essential game week 16 plus. And based on Nkunku's injury timeline, which I believe is coming back in January, you're still going to enjoy that beautiful Chelsea fixture run from game week 16 to 20. And keep in mind, of course, as I always say, that this first wild card for the first half of the season is going to last you at least until game week 20. You don't want to be wasting transfers on the least important position in your team. For example, I will not be transferring Archer out to someone else in the short term, unless some sort of god tier pick comes up, and you don't want to waste transfers in, for example, the least important position in your team. So why not get it right with Palmer at the back of your bench if you're wildcarding? This, of course, would sort of incentivize going 3-4-3. So it really depends on whether you actually value the 3-4-3 draft at all. As far as the other midfield positions in terms of, those sort of middle to premium picks, so I talked about Mitoma, Bowen. I actually think one pick that hasn't really been discussed too much is Szoboszlai. And Szoboszlai is an interesting one because his underlying stats so far for Liverpool have been very, very poor, or very, very average compared to what they have been in Red Bull Leipzig. However, the positions that he was actually getting in the Brighton game were actually quite advanced. So I do think that there is maybe a bit of scope to say that Szoboszlai could be, playing an interesting role within certain games for this Liverpool team. So it kind of reminds me when Gakpo sometimes would play at the sort of center forward position, but also at times in the midfield. Szoboszlai could be someone who you could see play a little bit more advanced, just like in the Brighton game. And that could be very, very beneficial towards him going forwards. I don't have the full confidence in him, but the thing about Liverpool is that you are now sort of looking at fantastic fixtures. And I think as a midfield differential, Szoboszlai is very, very interesting to me. Now, of course, he doesn't have the same underlying stats, as I said, as a Bowen or even a Mitoma so far, but the fixtures are there. And I think also the guarantee of his minutes are there as well. Whereas you're looking at Mitoma, unfortunately, probably only going to be 82, 83 minutes on average, which has been the case so far this season. I think the reality is just because Brighton are also having a tough time within the European fixtures, Mitoma will also have to be prioritized there because they actually need to get points in their Europa League matches because they have been struggling so far to get them. So that is the reality as well. And I do think Szoboszlai is an interesting pick, but I would probably hold and probably wait until game week 10 and actually make that transfer. You probably have a little bit more time to actually make that transfer and actually go for someone like Bowen instead, who I think I would prefer. And at that time, you can also make a judgment call on someone like Martinelli as well. We'd get an update on Trossard's injury status because keep in mind, of course, he was also precluded from international play from an injury. So I think waiting for game week 10 to actually see if Martinelli and Bowen are better picks, or even Mitoma, for example, would be better. But if you actually want to transfer immediately for game week 9, I think Szoboszlai is fantastic because the fixture run basically already starts. As far as the defender transfers, I think this week is actually all about waiting for Tsimikas news. Because in game week 10, in my opinion, my transfer will actually definitely be locked in towards an Arsenal defender. I will probably be investing in towards Gabriel Zinchenko, just given their sort of outrageous price because they've actually fallen a lot in price. Whereas when you're looking at Tsimikas, of course, if Robertson is out, and it seems like I've heard injury timelines from 3 weeks to 6 weeks to also 6 months if he has to take some sort of surgery. So that will have a huge impact on whether Tsimikas becomes a priority transfer, because as soon as game week 9, Liverpool have fantastic fixtures, even from a defensive point of view. And we have talked about the fact that Liverpool have played a lot of games, effectively 10 versus 11, but their defensive underlying stats have been really, really good. So I think this is a great time to actually consider Tsimikas as a transfer. And of course, if you have the information and you're on a wild card, this is a very easy time to actually pick up Tsimikas because it's actually quite hard to afford triple Liverpool, in my opinion. I don't think Darwin is as essential as we say. Trent, of course, is still very, very pricey, so it's still hard to stretch towards him into your team. And we don't know, let's say, between Konate and Matip, if anyone is truly nailed. So that creates a lot of problems into investing for Liverpool. And Tsimikas being available for fixtures going forwards will be incredibly interesting. And he must be an essential player on a wildcard if, let's say, Robertson's out for a long time. So really just have to sort of wait for Robertson's injury diagnosis, and then we can actually move towards Tsimikas at that time. As far as other transfers, as I said, I think it's a question about rolling. Now, if you don't have Newcastle defenders whatsoever, this is once again another potential fixture to go for a Newcastle defender. I don't really think there's any other teams to target. You might want to go for Dallo, you might want to go for Cash, but I don't think they're necessarily essential. I think both of those positions, as I've been talking about within my wildcard drafts, is something that you can actually make that 50-50 toss up, because Dallo still has incredible fixtures, but how can you really have any confidence in this United team? They have really failed to deliver. Even from the defensive point of view, their underlying stats have been very poor. But of course, the attack has been even worse. They've actually still gotten 2 clean sheets so far. Quite a jammy one versus Wolves, but a deserved one, I would say, versus Burnley, even though Amdouni did hit the post. Just a case of where, look, inevitably you're going to get clean sheets, and more than likely when you have fixtures like Luton, Fulham, and also Sheffield United, you're probably going to get one of them. And Dallo has actually been very attacking so far, so that could be a huge benefit towards going for Dallo. But as I said, I think this is a very simple time to just go for what should be a very nice Newcastle clean sheet given Eze's injury condition. That just means it's very easy to go towards Burn or Botman, or even, let's say, invest into Shaw and Trippier if you haven't already. I myself would still prioritize them as follows. I think someone at Botman / Burns price is probably still the priority, just because I think Trippier, you can argue that he's someone who also blocks you from getting some really priority picks in the midfield, and also potentially from Salah, Haaland. So I myself, for example, had to go with Richarlison to sort of accommodate for Trippier on my wild card, and you might have to ask yourself the same question when you're investing into Trippier. Now, as far as other defenders, as I said, you can just wait for Arsenal defenders on game week 10 and simply just wait for news on Tsimikas and Robertson as well. As far as the forward position, I really don't think there's actually any sort of updates in terms of forward position. What I would say is that there has been a sort of emerging budget forward coming out. I think Lyle Foster is clearly that sort of player. He is much cheaper than, for example, Morris, and underlying stats so far for Burnley have been a little bit more appealing. I also think that when you're, let's say, talking about, let's say, comparing to Cole Palmer, he is one option that can sort of accommodate a 3-5-2 draft, where if, let's say, Lyle Foster is your third forward, there could be some fixtures where if you plan rotation within the future, that he can be quite an interesting asset, right? He could help you go for some midfielder picks that actually maybe have some poor fixtures in the short term that you actually want to keep long term, that Lyle Foster can cover quite well in. So I think he sort of has the same sort of role as Palmer that I introduced in terms of the midfield position, but this would really be if you're flexible, if you actually like that sort of deep rotation and you want to have 8 attackers. Otherwise, I think the forward position is quite dull. It's a case of maybe track you on, let's say, Alvarez, whether he actually gets to start the Brighton game, which I think is rather unlikely, just because of the fact that they actually have a lot of rotation now that can actually cover his minutes, and also the fact that, of course, he's coming back from South America. At the same time, I think Darwin also suffers from similar sort of issues, as does Luis Diaz. So it's a case of maybe actually just going towards someone like Højlund, who still has 3 fantastic fixtures in 4, or just simply going towards Watkins, right? Because it's once again another home fixture, and right after that, it's Luton Town at home. So really, this is the priority to let's say, move towards Watkins, particularly if, let's say, you're, let's say, sick of Haaland or for whatever reason, and you want to move out of Haaland, and you want to, let's say, prioritize Salah captaincies, and you prefer the balanced nature of a non-Haaland draft. That is an option as well. But of course, as I said, as someone who myself is sort of operating within a Salah Haaland structure, just because I want to capture all the best captaincies for the next few weeks, I do think you can still create a very balanced draft, which still has Watkins within it. So he is still the priority for me long term. Now, as far as actually the captaincy this week, I think a lot of people have been sort of tired of, let's say, Haaland and his lack of haul since, for example, the Fulham game. Of course, we had, for example, a goal in the West Ham game, but he has also been rather unclinical. Now, the Arsenal game is sort of new stimulus in the sense that that's one of the first few times we've seen Arsenal shut Haaland out, or any team really in the Premier League. So one thing I would say is that his underlying stats so far have still been astoundingly good. The main thing, of course, comes down to his clinical finishing not being at its best this season. What I would say, though, is I would not be the type of person who would bet against Haaland, and I also wouldn't be the person to bet against Brighton so far. Their defense has been alarmingly poor. If anything, you can see that Salah's biggest haul this season has come against this Brighton team, which is not surprising. This was also away from home. Looking at City, a team that actually is much better, much more proficient from the attacking point of view at the Etihad, I really don't think you can actually pass up on a chance to go for a captaincy for Haaland at home. Now, keep in mind, of course, Salah and Son themselves have fantastic home fixtures. I think also when you look at goal scoring odds, actually Haaland is clearly up there, but creativity will also sort of lend towards Salah and Son being better picks, as well as, being midfielders as well. But in my opinion, this is so clearly a good Haaland captaincy, just because the level of opponent is very poor from the defensive point of view, and City's at home. I still would take this opportunity to go with Haaland, even though Salah and Son themselves have good fixtures. We can also talk about how Everton have actually been a team that have really, performed well on an underlying level, and also failed to perform when it comes to actuality, right? For example, conceding 2 versus Luton, creating 4 XG and only scoring 1 in that game. does suggest that obviously Everton have struggled with a little bit of growing pains, but I think the underlying data suggests that they're actually a very robust team. Whereas with Brighton, for example, we have the confidence that they're actually a very, very weak defense. So I would actually probably swerve the Salah captaincy. I know it was so super tempting to sort of chase last week's points, but I still would prioritize Haaland, then Salah, and then I would go with Son. Mostly just because I think Son so far this season has been rested and he's been sort of dealt with in a very appropriate manner by Angie, just because Angie, of course, is cognizant of the fact that he has injured players and he's dealing with someone who's also dealing with a sort of continuous knock. So I don't like the fact that Son actually has less minutes. Players like Salah and Haaland, unless there's specific game state conditions, like for example, Salah having to be taken off because he was playing in that 9 versus 11 game versus Spurs, that also really doesn't really count, in my opinion, when I'm looking at minutes. That's such an exceptional circumstance. And I think this is the time really to just bask in someone who's going to get the 90 minutes versus weaker teams. So therefore, I would just prioritize going with Haaland this week. And that's where I'll put my captaincy. But I don't think you can actually go wrong. And it comes down to the fact that, as I said from the outset of this video, that everyone has a good fixture this week. A lot of the people that we, don't rate, for example, within United, also have a good fixture. So it's very hard to actually move off of any of your assets. I think, if anything, this is a week to actually sort of test your patience, roll, and then move on towards the next week. And I think Sterling is such a good example of that from the previous week, where you have an asset who didn't really perform too much. Unfortunately, was also missing from the Fulham game because of illness, and still within a great fixture, ultimately delivers. Right, again, another super haul. And I think this is very, very possibly the case with someone like Haaland as well, who I think the estimation of Haaland has dropped quite far short of what he truly is. And ultimately, that's it for the video. So thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you guys next with the What We Have Learned video. It's sort of a recap of what we sort of projected in terms of Game Week 5 and seeing how things have moved on, how teams have performed since then, and how our thoughts and feelings of each team within the league has moved. And just to sort of compare team strengths as well as fixture difficulty schedules, as well as potential wildcard strategy plans. So see you guys there and take care for the rest of this week. Hope you guys enjoyed the international break.